most of you know Bill Neale. And Bill, what is your official title with the NMR right now? Director of
I'm called the Central Director. I'm on the NMRA Board of Directors, the National Board of Directors.
Okay.
And the idea was for me to represent the central part of the country, but it's not like a congressman representing an area. I just am generally elected from a group of my peers in the Midwest area, but my responsibilities are national oversight. You know, a board of directors for any corporation has some fiscal and other responsibilities to make sure things operate correctly. Now, I'm no financial whiz or anything else like that, but I do help people make decisions, and I tend to help with a lot of the conversations involved. But we meet twice a year on official meetings, and then we meet once a month for working meetings. But it's an interesting bunch of guys. Right. I'm on my second term, and then I'm term limited after that. I'll be retired.
That's sad.
I know, that's the way it goes. So they're pushing on me to do some other offices, but I think I'm going to probably resist.
So we wouldn't normally go direct with you. You're at the upper echelon. You work with those people, and we go within our region.
Well, Bob Weinheimer is the regional representative. So if you're a regional president or divisional president, you want to talk to Bob, and Bob would represent you at the board of directors meeting.
Okay. All right.
But on the other hand, I have never, ever discouraged anyone from talking to me about NMRA issues, and I'll be glad to deal with what I can.
Okay.
You know, we're all volunteers, and we're all working within the constraints of a volunteer organization. It's
right.
It's not like a corporation, I found out.
Yeah.
In a corporation, you got people you've hired, you pay them to do a job, and you can jump on them if they don't do it. With volunteers, it's a little bit different.
Yeah, so, it certainly is.
You know, we all have to be diplomatic, I suppose, is the term to put. So.
Okay, well, why don't we go ahead and get started with your presentation, Bill? I'll let you tell them exactly what you're going to do, and then you carry on from there.
Let me do a share screen here. Let's see if I can get this guy up and working. Let's see. Okay, let's see if this. Do you guys see a PowerPoint's presentation?
Yes.
Well, that's a win from the beginning there. Okay, let's see.
Excellent.
That looks pretty good, doesn't it?
Excellent. Yes.
Okay. I like to start with this slide. It's a painting from Griff Teller done in 1953 called Crossroads of Commerce, and this represents the area I model. In particular, we're standing in West Virginia, actually in the Panhandle of West Virginia, and we're looking across the Ohio River at Steubenville, Ohio. And Steubenville, Ohio, Weirton Junction, which is behind us, and this bridge are all part of a model railroad. Now, the sad part about this picture, this is the only one that I've ever found that really is artistic representation of the Panhandle Railroad. The Panhandle was a railroad that the Pennsy constructed out of 150 different corporate beings to stretch from Pittsburgh west to St. Louis. They also branched up and hit Chicago with the second line. But the sad part about this is this is the last calendar painting where they had a steam locomotive represented. And I like all steam. I actually modeled this area in 1939, back before the duplexes started running, back before weird engines started going across Pennsy. They were all very common steam engines like 210Os and 210-2s and 282s and so on. So that's my hot spot. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about freight car weathering, but in particular steam era freight car weathering. A couple points here. Some of you guys may have been at Andy's when I kind of went through some of these techniques. If you were there, you can probably sleep through a lot of this, which is okay too. But I want you to understand this clinic is derivative and additive. And what I mean by that is it's derived from a lot of other people that have come up with these techniques. And I've simply stolen them or used them or adapted them one way or another. And it's additive in that it's not an end-all be-all presentation on weathering. If you've got some techniques you use, that's great. You might find some of these techniques that I'm going to show you additive to whatever repertoire of techniques you're currently using for weathering. So we'll move from there. I want to talk about the late steam era. I mean, there's a lot of era that is steam. I'm just going to bypass the whole front end of the steam era and talk about the late steam era, which I reckon is from about 1910 until the end of steam. Now, this is a remarkable area. I think many people model the transition era as steam engines were being phased out. But if you look at the heart of the steam era, there are some characteristics that you got to understand about the way cars and buildings and vehicles and whatever are going to look. And one of the things to note first is that this is the period, right at the beginning of this period, was when locomotive size just about doubled. If you think about it, we went from 440s and 460s to USRA type locomotives in a very short period of time, really almost 5-6 years. And at least one rail historian I know, a guy out by you guys, Jack Kozanich, used to tell me, he says, this was as big a change as going to diesels. I thought that was an interesting perspective. But if you think about it, locomotives doubled in size, tractive effort doubled in size, the weight on the rails doubled in size. That meant all the train lengths doubled in size. So you had to make passing sidings longer, yards had to change, all the turntables and engine houses had to be changed. And part and parcel of that was this huge increase in dirt and dust and coal smoke that took place. Now, most of us born after World War II or during World War II, the baby boomer generation, which many model herders are, never experienced the real dirty part of the Eastern railroads and how things really looked at the time. I mean, Pittsburgh had to keep their streetlights on 24/7 because it was so damn dark. You got to realize how dirty things were back then. And even out west, although the air is a little cleaner, take a hard look at these freight cars and look at how grimy they are. I mean, they're just a nasty mess. You also have to figure that in 1945, the Pennsylvania Railroad served 45% of American industry. That's a huge number. That means that most of these cars probably went in and out of the Rust Belt Northeast area at least 2 or 3 times in their lifespan, maybe more often than that. So they're all going to collect this dirt and grime and dirt and coal dust and that sort of thing. So my perspective is if you're modeling the late steam era, things are going to be really dirty. So, okay, you've got this massive increase in locomotive size. You've got all these smokestack industries that were unbound by the EPA. So that resulted in this grime, smoke, and cinders and grease all over the place. Plus, you've got really widely varied levels of maintenance. If you think about it, you've got from 1910 to 1929, this high growth time, and increasing traffic and locomotive growth. Now, things were pretty well taken care of before the 1929 crash. But after that, you've got this deferred maintenance, not enough people around to maintain the equipment. It kind of got run down a little bit. And then they get slammed by this 1940, 1945 extraordinary traffic volume. Wear and tear was incredible. I've seen pictures of Horseshoe Curve in 1943 where the cinders on the main tracks were up to the rail heights. They were up to the tops of the rail. There were only flangeways and railheads showing. The traffic was just incredible. And of course, then it's coupled to this decline in traffic and the rapid replacement of steam, which means you got a lot of turnover here where you have relatively new looking cars plus a lot of really crusty older cars. So I like to weather things. I like them to look as realistic as possible. It adds, in my perspective, how things looked back then. And I try to recreate that vision, that view. The more I can do it, the more crustier I can make things look, the more realistic I feel it is. Now, hopper cars always got abused, so you can see these are pretty nasty here. By the way, I don't know that I'll be able to take questions as I go. You're certainly welcome to ask
can I fuck you in the ass?
What's that? Oh, okay, but I won't be able to see the chat room as I go. So if somebody can keep an eye on that, I'd be more than glad to answer questions. Okay, so here's what I'm going to present. We're going to look at some prototype pictures. I'm going to talk about some of the characteristics that I see in these prototype pictures. We're going to talk about some basic paints and colors we should use. Some techniques. You're going to kind of look over my shoulder in a virtual manner as I do some weathering. And then I'm going to show you some extra tricks and some weathering sins that I'm bothered by. And then we'll close up with some examples and maybe some inspiration. By the way, when you look at this picture at the bottom, this is a cool picture. I like this picture of, I believe it's a Mikado. Look back here at the back of the tender. This tender is not rusty. That's brake shoe dust up there. He probably was had another locomotive in front of him tossing up a lot of brake shoe dust. Who knows what? But that's a pretty interesting look, I think. So you can see there's a lot of red in here. Now, there's some red shift in this slide, but it's still pretty neat.
No, put your train in your dig.
Is there someone asking a question?
No, just an asshole.
Oh, okay. That happens too.
Yeah, exactly. They're showing their mentality.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of immature people on the internet, unfortunately. Yep. The other thing that's interesting is look at the white paint up on the post here as a safety. That was as much safety as you got in the 1930s and 40s. So, okay. So what's the problem with steam era weathering? Well, finding out what the color palette is. There's a lot of black and white photography, but you really got to struggle to find the color stuff. However, you can see a lot of things in this picture. Look at this boxcar down at the bottom right corner. They got a board replaced there. That's pretty interesting. A lot of different color variation in the boards on the roof walk here. You can also see that the paint flakes off the top of boxcars. It's very common to see this. The tops of boxcars were usually made with galvanized steel, and paint in the 30s, 40s, and 50s was not as good as it is now, and they had a hard time getting it to stick to galvanized steel, particularly when it got hit with a lot of sunshine and a lot of weathering. So you see a lot of this kind of look to boxcars. Now, if you do look around, Google is your friend. You can find some color pictures of cars from the 30s and 40s. Steam mirror cars. I love this Southern boxcar. I got to build this eventually. You can see where they replaced the double doors. This is a shop track here. And I think the doors probably were breaking down and they had to replace the doors. You can see they're newly repainted. But it also gives you an idea how wood cars looked. And I would say that for the most part, we model railroaders do not have enough wood boxcars on 1960s or earlier layouts. There were a lot of them, and they were very prevalent, both double sheath and single sheath boxcars. And it's important to have a good collection of those. So I have stock in AccuRail, so please buy. No, but they make a great set of boxcars. Okay, so what happens here? We get cinders and ash and soot coming down from the top. We get the dirty stuff coming up underneath. We get sanding dust, brake shoe dust, which is rusty in color, and just general grime and dirt comes up off of the roadbed. And of course, bearing grease comes off the bearings. The old friction bearings were very greasy. I'll talk about that in a minute. And you get end splatter from the car in front or in back of the car weathering. Of course, there's some intentional human stuff. There's paper tacked on tack boards here and here. There's some chalk marks. I won't touch too much of this stuff because I don't do it very well, unfortunately. I wish I did, but I don't. I will show you some good examples of it, but I'm still looking for the best ways to do this kind of stuff. So let's talk a minute about wheel color. Friction bearing trucks. Now, this does not hold true for roller bearing trucks, but friction bearing trucks had brass bearings in the top, and people stuffed cotton waste with oil into the journal boxes. You can see the lid lifts up there, and they stuffed in there. All the Bettendorf trucks you guys have were like this. The oil flowed onto the axle and kept the brass bearing and the axle lubricated. In doing that, that grease flowed out the back of the axle bearing and onto the wheel face. So in about 3 miles after getting a new wheel, you'd see the oil all over the face of this wheel, including the rim, and it would pick up grime and dirt rapidly. So you never really want to have a shiny wheel face on your model railroad. Now, if you model a modern era, this rim gets hit by self-guarding frogs and would be shiny. But for most of us in the transition era or earlier, This whole wheel should be like a dark gray. So, all right, here's another nice picture of a prototype. You can see here the roof paint on this boxcar is pretty much gone. And you can see the interior of this gondola is all kind of rusty looking, nasty, kind of beat up looking. Yeah.
Shut the fuck.
Go ahead.
No, it's Terry, can you delete Nabil Khan, some idiot?
Yeah.
Will do.
Shut the fuck up, you pussy bitch.
Oh, get out of here, you idiot.
Fuck off, pussy. Choke on that. I bet your mom's dead. Pussy, suck my dick.
I don't think he's participating. Okay, here's another great picture from Jack Delano. I think this is in Chicago. He took a picture of the Chicago Northwestern Yard out there, the big one. And you can see a couple things. You can see how the boxcar red paint fades to almost a purpley color with grime getting into the wood. And it's also important. Look at how many wood cars there are in this yard. Look at all these cars. They're almost all wood. And this was taken, I believe, in 1940 or 1942, somewhere in that range. So you can see here how a newly repainted Chicago Northwestern, I think this is this has refrigerator car doors, but does not have ice hatches. I'm not sure what kind of car this is, but you can see its twin over here is really faded away. You can also catch up on the roof here on this car. You know, there's some interesting effects here. And lastly, in this picture, I'll point out these refrigerator cars sitting up here in the upper corner. Most people have refrigerator cars that are way too clean, and they got grimy, particularly in the late steam era. So this is another Jack Delano picture, again, 1940s. This is a freight house. You can see how they stack the cars up. I think the freight house is over on this side, and they would lay planks between their cars and unload the center cars, the end cars first, and then the center cars afterwards. And that way they could get a lot of cars stacked up. There's a lot of traffic through here. But look at the grimy ends of these cars. You know, there's a lot of old rust showing through. There's a lot of paint missing on the roofs. Roof walks in particular. I mean, this is just raw wood put out there in the weather. Yeah, it had paint for a little while, but that's long gone in many cases. And a lot of gray colors in this roof on these roof walks. So that's something we should think about committing to when we start weathering cars. I love these refrigerator cars. These are all MTD Merchants Dispatch cars sitting in Chicago. And one of the things you can notice, look at how the individual boards stand out. Now, some of that is because sunlight hits these boards and you see the shadows in between the boards. It's kind of an interesting effect. And you can recreate that by putting an India ink wash on these cars. I'll show you how I do that. But you can also see how the doors stand out. You can see the door seams pretty easy too. And most model cars, that gets kind of lost with the overall paint, yellow paint job. So this is kind of a fun picture to look at. Again, I'm trying to get close to looking like this, so I'm going to work on some cars. And when you look over my shoulder, I'm going to attack one of these refrigerator cars. So let's weather something. By the way, this is a good picture of how grimy things were. Here's a couple of Mikados sitting here just idling. I think this one might be a decapod. And look at the mess they're making. They had their blowers turned on and all this coal smoke being pulled out. Nasty stuff. At any one time, you guys know, there was almost a ton of coal in flames, in hot burning flames in the firebox. If they ever had to lose water and dump their fire, what they're doing is basically dumping a ton of hot coal onto the roadbed. And no wonder they had problems with that. So interesting stuff. So here's what I use for colors and paints. I use these two paints for very specific items. Burnt sienna and raw sienna make great rust colors. Raw umber and burnt umber make dark. Raw umber makes a good wood color, by the way. Burnt umber makes a good dirt color. But in addition to that, I love these Vallejo paints. They're really nice paints. I use raw steel for some items, like on freight car roofs. There's something called Old Rust, which is part of their gaming colors. Old Rust is a great color to put over another color. It's a thin, almost a wash, but it works really well. Then, of course, some earth colors and some black gray colors. I use black gray a lot on the wheel faces. I use slate gray, which is just a craft paint. I'll use this on wood surfaces to start with a gray. This is something that you can't get anymore, but it was a sand color. Sand is a great representation of raw wood. So if they're going to replace a plank in a roof walk, this is a good color to use for that. And of course, I use some black India ink mixed with alcohol. I don't really have a specific formula, but I'll kind of work my way around that, and I'll talk to you guys about that. So I also use pastels. I use AIM products quite a bit. They have something called Delta Dirt, which is a wonderful, wonderful color. Browns, rusts, and some grays for great colors. Pan pastels are essentially the same thing, but with some material mixed in with them that causes them to stick better. I do like pan pastels too, but I'll use them all in combination. And I don't get all the pan pastels. I got a lot of pan pastels here because I was experimenting, but basically I use their black, I use their raw sienna and burnt sienna, and that's about it. So if you're going to get pan pastels, if you can just stay kind of in this range, you'd be okay. We're gonna start weathering some of these refrigerator cars, and these are nice PFE refrigerator cars. They are single herald. In other words, there's just a single herald on the side here and here. You can't really see this one too well, but these are pre-World War II paint scheme refrigerator cars. The post-World War II cars had a herald on both sides. Evidently, the Southern Pacific or the UP, one or the other, thought that they were not getting enough advertisement, so they went to the double herald. But you'll notice that each of these things has a lot of board by board set off. You can see them pretty well. Now here you can see the door very well. This one, not so much. It's very hard to see the door frame in there, but it's still pretty good. And I want to do one of these cars to see what they look like. Now this is the car I finished weathering. I tried to get some of the wood board by board effects, some gray tones in the bottom where the paint is starting to come up and the wood is starting to, it's not a rot, but just a weather of the wood. And the wheels are of course painted. So let's see how I went at this. I'll show you guys what I did. The first problem is if you look at these red caboose cars, they're lovely, lovely models. You can see through them. You see my finger here. You can see the herald that's printed on the outside here. And that's a problem because if you build this as is, it's going to have sort of a day glow color to it. It's going to look like there's light on the inside because the light will come from the back side and go right through these things. So the first thing I do is I paint the inside black. I just get some craft paint, a broad brush, and just put it in there. And I'll paint the bottom too because I don't want any light showing through here at all. So once I paint it black, you'll be surprised at how quickly that changes the way the car looks and how much improvement that is. Very simple thing. Doesn't take any artistic talent, just slobber the black paint on. And then I start working on the trucks. And I will take, this shows my paintbrush. I'll just simply hold the truck in one hand and spin the wheel, holding my brush against the inside of the wheel. And that covers this area with a black, I use the Vallejo black gray, and it's a pretty good color to use. You can see this one's still wet. I'll usually wind up coming upstairs with a lot of little gray spots on my fingers, but that's all right. It works okay. And I paint the truck frame. Those of you will notice that in the process of trying to record these pictures, hold the truck, hold the paintbrush, and get what I wanted, I managed to dip the paintbrush too far into the paint. So I paint way up on the heel of the paintbrush here. You don't necessarily need to do that. That's not part of the weathering clinic, so that's just my mistake. But I'll also make sure I do the ends of the journal boxes here, just so I get the whole truck kind of painted black. You can do the axles, but I found the axles don't show very much, and you don't have to worry too much about those. Let's see here. Okay, now I'll get a stiff paintbrush, one of these flat bladed paintbrushes, and I'll sort of dry brush a coat of medium gray on the roof walk. You can see it right here. And I want to make sure I do the ends of the roof walk. I don't want the gray paint just sitting on the top of the boards. I want to sit it on the ends here and on the sides. One of the weathering sins is to only put the paint on the top surface and not on the sides. It gives sort of what I call a painted lady effect. Slate gray is a good color. There's another one called sky gray. They're both good colors to use. It's a lot of gray paint. You can leave the whole thing just gray if you want. And I let a little bit of A little bit of the paint show through, a little bit of the boxcar red paint, but not necessary. You can paint them solid gray if you like, but you got to put some texture in them after that. And while I've got the gray out, I'll dip my paintbrush in a little bit of water and put a little gray on the bottoms of the car sides here, the car ends rather, and the car sides. And you'll notice this doesn't look very good. I just kind of slobber it on here. It's on top of the paint job. That's okay. We're going to fix that in a little bit. I'll show you how I get after that. But this is a good start, the gray along the bottom here. Now, I like the door outlined, and I'll use a sharp number 2 pencil to do that. I'll kind of draw it along the seam, just pull along the seams where the door is. Number 2 pencil is our friend and makes a little bit of a dark line right there. And the graphite gives a little bit of a greasy metallic look to it. It kind of works out pretty good. And then after this, now you have to wait until this gray paint dries. I do it the next day. I will wash the car with a light, with a mixture of alcohol and India ink, just a very light mixture. What this does is it creates, the India ink will settle down into the seams between the boards and will create that shadow effect where you can actually see the boards better. You can see right here how it looks. Now, one piece of advice that's critical, do the whole car side and let it dry flat like this. Don't try to do one side and tip it up on its bottom, because the paint, I'm sorry, the alcohol and India ink will run to the bottom of the car and not give you the effect you want. Lay it flat, do this, it will dry in about 10 minutes, then turn over and do the other side. But be careful about tilting it. And you also want to work with a wet paintbrush. You want to draw the paint all the way from the top down to the bottom. You don't want to stop halfway down and look at it. Draw it all the way down, because otherwise you'll get a water stain halfway down, an India ink stain. And that stuff is really hard to get rid of. Okay. Now I kind of used a stiff brush to kind of scrub the alcohol a little bit. It did tend to pick up some of the gray paint that I put on there and smear it around a little bit, but not too much. Now, while I'm waiting for the paint to dry, I will sometimes do all kinds of things to roof walks. I like to damage them pretty badly. They're not my friend. So I'll run a sanding stick along them just to get some grain in there and some texture. And what that does is it also brings out the boxcar red through the gray. So I'll get some graining in there. And then I'll take a few of the boards and I will take some of the sand color, and you can get it in a variety of different paint schemes, and I'll do some individual boards like that. Now, if I want them to stand out, I'll stop here. And weathering is a lot like gambling. It's just knowing when to stop. You know, you can't really win, but you just got to know when to stop. And I could have just stopped right here with these fresh boards showing, and that would have been fine. But I decided to take another step. I wanted to have them age a little bit. So I went in with some of that tube burnt umber paint and raw umber paint, and I dry brushed it just a little bit, put it on here and make it a little browner, and just set it aside to dry. Now, I thought I didn't have enough dark stain on the car to match the prototype I was going for. So I've gone back again with another wash of India ink. If you use a light mixture, and I would guess maybe 2 or 3 drops per ounce of alcohol. That's just a guess, because I kind of play with it until I get it where I want it. You can go over it multiple times. Each time it becomes additive. The more India ink gets applied to the surface, and it gets darker and darker, but that's okay. I mean, if you do as much as you want, because I'm going to go back here and I'm going to lighten this in just a few minutes. And by the way, I do the underbody a little bit. I don't spend a lot of time weathering the underbody. Most of my cars stay on the track. At least that's what I hope. Fingers crossed here. And I don't have to worry too much about people saying, oh, that car's not weathered underneath. So I'll use some tans and rusts on some of the colors that show, some of the areas that show, like the underframe, center sill, and the brake cylinder and stuff. I'll make some color, put some color in there. And here's the secret. This is a fiberglass pencil. You can get it from Micromart. And I use it to draw down across the boards. Now I keep the little fiberglass end short here, and I use sticky tape for cleanup. As you use this fiberglass pencil, it will break. The little fiberglass shards will break off and lie on the car body and on the bench and on your fingers if you're not careful. I use sticky tape to clean up everything, clean up the car with sticky tape, everything. Don't touch your face while you're doing this. Don't ask me how I know. You don't want to do that. but it's very effective. And I will take swipes vertical. Now I will move you got to move the pencil vertical. If you use your wrist, you'll get an arc when you do the weathering job here. You want to kind of use your shoulder and go from top to bottom and pull the fiberglass pencil along all that paint you put on there. And what it does is it scratches the paint off the top of the boards and creates a very nice board by board look. You see here where I've gone board by board. This is not as good a picture as it should be, but you can see how I'm getting the board by board look. And that also takes this gray paint that I put along the bottom here and begins to push it down into the corners. Really didn't push it. It takes it off the boards and pushes it down in the corners, so it makes it very subtle. Don't do this with a decal car unless you're very careful about working around the decals, because you will take the decals right off. Again, don't ask me how I know. It's a painful lesson. So while I'm at it, I will put some Indy ink on the roof. You can see how my boards turned out. Again, it's not terribly gray. I've let some of the boxcar red paint show through. We can see some of the boards where it looks like they've been replaced some time back. But I'll work my Indy ink on here. And one of the things I tend to do quite often is, as I've got a wet paintbrush with the alcohol, I will dip it very carefully, very lightly into some of my weathering powders. The alcohol will carry those powders and push it into the corners here and give it some texture. It's kind of a nice way to go. So this is how it turns out. You can see how the gray paint was distributed a little bit better, and how I got the board by board look. I've taken a lot of the dirt off those boards, so it looks a little cleaner than it did. But you can see how the overall car turned out. For these metal fixtures, if you touch them with a number 2 pencil, you get sort of a metallic look. On here, you'll hit it with a pencil, but nevertheless, even using the fiberglass pencil, dragging it down across here, you get some highlights there. And you can see also I pull it down through the painted emblem just to get a board where the emblem's faded a little bit. By the way, you should do some refrigerator cars with the hatches open. Quite frequently, vegetables were carried in these cars. They were not refrigerated. They used them as a ventilated car. And you'll oftentimes see plenty of cars going by with the hatches open. I think it's a nice effect. Now these cars, I'm going to have you look over the shoulders of whether these cars, these were built in 1934. There's a second set built in 1938. These are 34 cars. And in my 1939 railroad, these would be pretty clean. Not terribly dirty. You can see they've got some weather on them, but I want to show you how I approach them. First thing I did is, of course, paint the trucks. If you do nothing else from this clinic, go downstairs, paint the trucks on a train's worth of cars and see how they look. Don't use too much paint, otherwise they won't roll very well. But don't ask me how I know that one either. But do paint the trucks and the wheels. And I started here with the Indy ink alcohol wash over the car. Just to, you can see how light it is. There's hardly any Indy ink here at all, but this helps highlight the details. I don't use dull coat. Alcohol and dull coat don't mix very well. The alcohol gets into the surface chemistry of dull coat and will cause it to haze. Now you can get the haze to go away by just simply applying dull coat again, but you're back in the loop of getting haze that you really don't want. So I tend to avoid dull coat. I find that alcohol and Indy ink will immediately flatten any surface that it's put on. By the way, it's also great to put on your figures, your human beings in your model layout. A very light alcohol Indy ink wash will bring out their features and flatten all the coloration of the paint. Now, I used a cosmetic sponge here to apply some weathering powders. I think I was using Delta Dirt. I may have used Pan Pastels. It makes it a god-awful mess on the workbench, unfortunately, but I was pushing it on the sides of the cars and working my way along there. And I thought, gee, when I looked at it, it was way too bland. It was just too even a covering over here. So what do you do when you wind up with that? Well, there's a trick. Alcohol will pick up the weathering powders and move them around. So if you get that alcohol Indy ink wash again and put it on here, and again, I'm working with very light, very little Indy ink in the alcohol. I can push those pastels off the center panels and into the rivets very easy. And in fact, I can use a paper towel and simply wipe the pan pastels off the center panels. So I start to get the black dirt, the grime along the rivet lines, but the panels are relatively clean. And that worked out pretty well for me. Oh, by the way, I went after roof walk again. Again, I'm abusing it. I do paint the edges of the roof walk to make sure. And one of the other tricks I've found is that if you take your hobby knife and roll it around the end of the roof walk, so you cut those grooves, so they're not, the casting is a smooth end on these roof walks. And if you cut the end a little bit where the boards are and show the individual boards, it looks better. You won't notice it directly, but your eye will pick up a detail there that looks appropriate. It kind of works out good. So this is how the car is starting to look. I'm very happy with this. I haven't pushed the roof walk down yet. You can see it's still sticking up. But I'm starting to get the paneled effect that I like in these kinds of cars. And I put a little bit of dust and rust colors on the trucks. I don't put too much on the wheel face, but mostly on the truck frame. And I went and worked some more pan pastel black and soot along the roof seam. So I wanted these to stand out a little bit more. That's a nice detail. I like to see how that looks. And voila, I have these cars done. They're weathered just enough. They look like they've been in business, and I'm very happy with the way they look. Now, wood cars. This is a well-abused narrow gauge car. You can see, though, how each individual board sort of weathers a little bit differently. And you can achieve this using that fiberglass pencil. Oh, I went too far here, excuse me. Here I am, I've got a New Haven, a 36-foot boxcar. And by the way, you guys that modeled 1950s probably are looking past Accurel 36 buck, can't speak tonight. You're probably looking past these 36-foot boxcars. The truth is, New Haven had a big customer, and I don't remember the name of them, who had their loading doors spaced at 36 foot. The New Haven kept a large fleet of these 36-foot boxcars in service well into the 1960s. So having a few of these run across your layout would not be a bad deal. I wanted to have a few. This is one of the Accurel 36-footers. I love these cars. Absolutely great models. I'm really glad Accurel brought these out. And you can see here, I'm taking my slate gray, just craft paint, and I'm just kind of using a water wet brush and washing some gray paint into the surface of these boards. You can see how it kind of looks. I've got a lot of gray down along the bottom here. Boy, it's a terrible picture. That's what I get for trying to hold everything and shoot the picture while I was going. But then I'm using the fiberglass pencil and dragging it down across each board, again, trying to go perfectly vertical so I get individual boards popping out. And what this does is it takes that India ink and gray paint and weathers it right into the surface of the paint that was on there from the manufacturer. And of course, I put a little bit of, you can use the India ink wash on the trucks too to bring out the trucks a little bit. So this is how this car looks, and it looks very nicely weathered, very appropriate for service. I use a little bit of rusty colors on the truck frames, and I'll put some on the couplers too. Again, I'll sometimes float the powder pigments in alcohol or in water and apply it that way, and it'll dry in a nice crusty looking rust. Now, let's talk about the boxcar roof. I like to replicate that galvanized metal look of rusted boxcar roofs. And you got to make it look a little bit metallic. Gray wouldn't be bad, but if you make it look too silvery, and this was probably too silvery, it doesn't look right either. But I did start with a silvery metallic color, and then I'm going to work it back into more of a dull metal color. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to rust this boxcar roof. And when I got done, this looked pretty good, but I wasn't satisfied with it. So I picked up some powder in the wet brush that I was using and started to add some rust texture here. And this looks pretty good too. This is not a bad place to stop. But again, it's like gambling. I just keep gambling until I lose all my money. I keep weathering here. So I went back and put some soot on there. I used some pan pastels black and made this roof pretty sooty. But okay, that looks pretty good, but maybe it's too dirty. Okay, how do you reverse the weathering? Well, I used a stiff paintbrush and started scrubbing it. I was able to scrub back to the metallic colors here. So I've got some rust tones, I've got some metallic tones, and I've got the soot that was originally that I finished with. So this gives me the color of roof that I liked, that I wanted. You can see I haven't put the brake wheel on yet. Save that for last. That's always a fun thing to do. And I have a lot of stem winders. By the way, Andy, when I operate, I always find a bunch of brake wheels on the ground. That's always a fun thing to see. I go through all the cars, I find all the brake wheels that are missing and replace them. So that's part of operations. So where do I stop? Well, I could have stopped with just a rusty roof. I could have stopped with a pretty sooty roof, or I could stop with a scrubbed down roof. Any of these is appropriate, and it's good to have a variety of these things on your railroad. So here's some more roof work. This car hasn't lost all of its paint yet. It's just coming off the panels, but still sticking around on the ribs. This one has more of the roof paint lost. So let's talk about some other weathering tricks. This is a shot of my yard, and you can see I do a lot of boxcar roofs, and I like to have things look pretty grimy. One of the tricks military modelers use is they will weather with a primer coat. This car was primed with a dark gray, and then the person who did this was one of my friends from the Friday night group I hang with. He used white coloring on top of the primer. Before he ever painted the car, he put white panels. He painted the panels white. Then when he puts the boxcar red on here, the color of the primer shows through just a little bit. You can see how the panels look a little bit brighter than the ribs. I thought that's a really clever approach. Military modelers use this a lot on painting their tanks or their armored vehicles, and it's a nice way to create a very subtle weathering effect. Now, gondolas, we need to talk about gondolas. I don't think there's ever been a clean gondola on a railroad that's existed past the first shipper or receiver. I used to work in a plant, and open gondolas that were unloaded were considered to be trash bins. Everything got thrown in them: lunch bags, old dunnage, and old whatever people could find and throw in them, they would throw in them, because the railroad would pull them away, and they didn't have to worry about getting rid of the trash. So these are a couple of gondolas I did. One of the problems with the Walthers cars, these great USRA gondolas, they're wonderful cars, but they have no interior detail other than the floor. There's nothing on the sides to indicate there are any rivets or fabricated sides here. There's no tie downs, nothing. So one of the things I did is I paint the inside of these things with a little bit of streaking and some rust and stuff like that. And my attempt here is to fool the eye into thinking there's more detail there than there actually is. You can see these things look pretty grimy. By the way, that cinder block that you saw in that car, that's a Finaro and Camerlingo offering. They give you a whole sheet of cinder blocks, both stacked and individual pieces. You can paint them in concrete color and flow them in whatever you want. This is a whole plethora of gondolas. I have an empty gond train that goes down to my steel mill, and this is the start of it. It's about 20 cars long. You can see how each one's weathered a little bit differently. There's some bits of marking tape that I cut really skinny to be banding. Some dunnage left over, some pipes, gosh knows what, some dirt from the backyard. Anything I could find to weather it, I did. Flat car decks, we can handle them the same way we did the wood car sides, but be even more abusive to them. I use a sanding stick to add some grain, and then start with gray color, and work out with sand and burnt umber and raw umber, and then use the fiberglass pencil to drag across there and create the board by board look. By the way, this load, I'm going to divert for a moment from weathering here because it's kind of a funny story. My sister and I like to give Christmas gifts that are annoying to each other, and she topped the list. She gave my grandkids these Tyrannosaurus Rex bubble guns. You'd pull the trigger on the Tyrannosaurus Rex somewhere around his privates, and he would blow bubbles and let out this awful scream, and his eyes would flash. Boy, that's really wonderful. Thanks, Lori. What a wonderful gifts for my grandkids. They're running around my house making all these bubbles and this god awful sound coming out of the items. Well, the batteries ran down pretty quickly. And I had to tell the kids, oh, it's really too bad. They must be broken. It's all right. We'll fix them later. And then I took them apart. And what I found inside these Tyrannosaurus Rex bubble guns was an air blower that looked like this. I thought that was pretty cool. It looked like a good enough a flat car load. So I painted an industrial color and put a number on it and strapped it down to my flat car. And that's the end of Tyrannosaurus Rex bubble guns. So, funny story. All right, gondolas. This is a flat kit, a flat-sided kit from Finero and Camerlingo. I had to describe the boards on the inside. This is just a smooth side, and I had to make individual boards out of it, which I did. And sometimes you can scribe these boards well enough, you can actually see through them. And that's a great effect. I also scalloped these boards in between these metal side stakes. The wood would wear and scallop a bit. So I filed that down just a little bit, just enough to show a little bit of wear and tear on it. Okay, weathering sins, good stuff. Okay, anybody that weathers a car and doesn't paint the wheel faces and the truck side frames is committing a sin. A moderate one, but a sin nonetheless. There's also the problem with what I call a painted lady effect. Some years ago, my friend Tony Custer showed how to weather 15 cars in 15 minutes. And it was a wonderful article, but almost all his cars had this pastel powder wiped on the panels, but not in the cracks. You see here where there's no weathering or to speak of on the insides of these side stakes. Almost all of it is on the panels, and that's a problem. It doesn't really, they really don't collect dirt that way. And the other problem you've got is too much airbrushing. This European modeler just went crazy with grinding black, and it really doesn't look quite right. So how do you do this? Well, you can fix the painted lady effect. Taking this car, again, going at it with alcohol wash, you can float that weathering powder into the cracks, wipe off the panels, you get a much nicer looking car. Number 2 pencils. This is also a fun thing to use. They work very well for creating a metallic look. If you take a number 2 pencil and take it on its side and wipe it down across these side stakes, you can create almost a metal look to them. And if it's sharp enough, you can run it down the rivet side of this thing and highlight the rivets. Just touching the rivets. Now you can see these are what they call Z boards or Z stakes, and they only have rivets on one side. You want to only hit that one side with a pencil, but if you run the pencil along there with a point, you can highlight those rivets and give them a little bit of a metallic look. It improves the look of the car, and again, it's something very subtle. It really helps how things will look on the layout. Now, I do weather everything. I weather buildings, I weather vehicles. I even use my India ink alcohol wash on my poor figures. And I weather my track, I weather my locomotives, even the water stand. Everything gets a little bit of a patina of weathering. Locomotives, they got pretty doggone dirty. So did the cabooses. In my case, they're called camping cars. Even railroads that were famous for keeping their steam locomotives in pristine condition, such as the New York Central, generally had a lot of grime on the locomotive by the time they got done with service. Or in fact, even halfway through a run, they got pretty doggone dirty. So I like to keep my locomotives dirty. I will keep things dirty from the boiler on down. Sometimes the boilers were pretty clean, the cabs were pretty clean, but from the running boards on down, it all looked like somebody dunked it in the grime. Cabooses, cabin cars. Here's a board by board effect. This was done very carefully with a very fine brush. A little bit of the fiberglass pencil was used, but not very often because this is a decal up here, and the fiberglass pencil will pull a decal right off the side of a car. Now, a little inspiration. These are not all my cars. Some of them belong to some other folks. How to weather these things. It's kind of interesting. Here's a nice grimy GM&O car. Again, another wood-sided car. You can actually use that wood weathering and go with horizontally weathered cars. You can see this one here has got some boards that are weathering and losing their paint or turning gray. I like this tank car. This one's a very subtle effect. I think it was done with an airbrush. Some earth tones were loaded. I think you just loaded a dirt color or an earth tone color in airbrush and caught the wheels and truck frames and a little bit of the underneath side of this tank car. It really looks great there. Oftentimes cars would be covered with the lading they were carrying or whatever load they were carrying. In this case, this car is carrying very light colored clay. This is on my layout, and since I'm modeling the Steubenville area, all you know about Steuben, China. It was made in that area. It was made from the clays off the Ohio River, and they were very light in color. This car is carrying that, and it's got some light color grind. Paint and peeling happens all the time. You can see how the sun has affected the top of this car and how it affects the sides. And that's an important thing to copy. You can even start with different colors of boxcar red. There's 3 hopper cars that are identical, and they all 3 have different color boxcar red as their starting color. This is more of an oxide color. This is a darker purpley color, and this is more of a true mineral red. All good. This is a Gym 6 model. I like this car. Very subtle. The car is weathered down the rivet lines, but the panels are fairly clean. Nice looking car. This is a fellow over in Europe that did some weathering. He had some intentional human things here, which I thought was pretty good. He actually put some interior to it. I do like this car. He's got rust collecting here. Oftentimes boxcar roofs would leak a bit, and the water would collect along the base of the wall here, and you get rusting along here. He's got that rust very nicely copied here. One of the errors that he made was he forgot to weather this inside of the door here. I'm sure if he looks at this picture hard enough, he'll correct that. This is a really nicely done picture, and nicely done car, I should say. This car is pretty much to the end of its life. This is not one of my cars. I do like the way the bubbled rust was modeled. Not quite sure how he did that, but boy, this car looks like it's ready to carry hides for one last run, and then it's going to get scrapped. But I do like the look of it. This model is by Eric Hansman. I wish I had caught the prototype he modeled this from, but he made identical, including these fresh boards in here that don't go all the way to the end, believe it or not. I would have thought the boards would have gone all the way to the end, but they were actually patched in this area. So he did a really nice job creating some patchwork in here. He did a nice job with the chalk marks on here too. You can see how he skip across the board seams, and he did a nice. I have seen this done very well with a white art pencil sharpened to a very fine point. You can do some of this work. He's got some nice scuff marks here too. Nice work on this. Another nice model. This is a little bit later than steam era, but you can see how nice the roof is done and how the rust is affecting the roof walk and that sort of thing, and how the various rust panels are in here. Door has scratched across the paint. Nothing could be finer than happened to a New York Central boxcar, but that's all right. So I weather everything to some degree. I like having the layout look a bit grimy. I've often thought about putting coal dust on my Digitrax throttles just so people will have the right feel for operating steam, but I've refrained from doing that. People do eat snacks around there, and I don't think they'd like the coal dust in the snacks. So anyway, that's the end of my presentation. Are there any questions?
Yeah, Bill, there's a couple that came up on chat.
Okay, good.
Let me go up. Steve Harsh asks, what paint do you use for the trucks that sticks to the plastic?
The Vallejo stuff sticks pretty well. I went to the hobby store and found something called black dash gray. You don't want flat black, you want black gray. And the Vallejo paint in those little squeeze bottles, I'll squeeze a little bit onto the brush and just apply it. It will stick to the trucks very well, the truck frames.
Okay. Another question is, does alcohol and acrylic paints have problems like dull coat?
No, dull coat is unique. You can use an acrylic flat, like Vallejo flat or Model Master flat, and it will not react to the alcohol like dull coat will. Dull coat's unique. It has different chemistry than the other flat paints. It's a little flatter actually than some of the dull coats. If you use a Vallejo flat, it will not create as flat a color tone as dull coat will, which I really like. But I find the Indy ink and alcohol stuff takes the place of dull coat. But I have seen dull coat used very effectively in weathering, so I'm not knocking it. It's just not something I use.
Okay. Then John Young asks, do you use dull coat to start your weathering to give some tooth to the car sides to hold the rest of the weathering materials?
No, I do not. My tooth comes from the alcohol and Indy ink wash. You do have to put some tooth on there, but I use that in place of the dull coat. The dull coat, if you're like a 1960s, 1980s modeler, you probably want your equipment to be cleaner than the steam era equipment. And dull coat's a great way to start that process and use a bit of dusting on the bottom, and it will, the tooth that dull coat provides will give you a nice approach. But the Indy ink alcohol wash, particularly if it's light, will work pretty much just as well.
From Will, how would you make the small rust streaks like on the New York Central boxcar?
Let me back up to that. See if I can find it here. There we go. This takes patience. This was probably done with two paints. Like this is probably a two paint right in here. And this is probably a two paint in here, where they drag it along with a paintbrush and you use it pretty thick. And then let it dry a little bit and then wipe downward to pull that rust down. And it takes some patience, and I would recommend starting on a blue box kit and experimenting, you know, because you don't want to start on the best model you've got. You want to start on the ugliest model you've got that you're going to throw away or give to your kids, you know, for that kind of thing. But it takes a little patience. I have seen this done very effectively with a combination of a little bit of oil paint and then picking up in the oil paint some of the weathering powders. And the weathering powder gives you a grit to the rust, which is, I think, an important texture. And then I've seen guys will spray dull coat across it and then go at it and put a second layer of rust on there and a third. Some will go up to as many as 5 layers to get a really heavily rusted spot. And that's a great way to go. Again, I don't use the dull coat, but that's an interesting approach. But I've also seen people use salt. I don't know if you guys know about the salt weathering technique, but it's pretty cool. If you take your painted, before you paint your car, if you're painting and decaling, and you put, say, wipe some water on it and then sprinkle salt from a salt shaker on it, then paint it and rub the salt off, it will look like rusty spots. You know, I paint the car first a rust color and then put the salt on there, then paint the finish color on there and rub the salt off. It will look incredible. A lot of the military modelers use that technique.
And Rick Ware was asking, in the photo of multiple tracks of boxcars at the freight house, it was an in view. Several of the cars had 2 blue flags, others just had 1. And I guess his question was, what was going on with those?
Well, that's a hell of a question. I'm not sure about that. Let's see. Let's go back to the beginning here. And let me advance through it. Let's take a look at that picture. That's a great question. Pardon me for going faster here, guys. There, right, this guy right here. Yeah, this car has 2 blue flags and this car has 2 blue flags. I do not know, unless usually the way a blue flag is handled is that the man who puts the blue flag on the car has to remove it. Nobody else can touch it. There may be 2 guys working these cars.
Exactly right. That's what's happening.
Okay, good.
Each flag is labeled with the guy's name, and then he is the only one that can remove it till he's out of the area.
So there's 2 guys working it. One guy can finish, pull a blue flag off, his blue flag, but the other blue flag stays on until the second man finishes.
Okay. All right. At this point, I think we're in a good spot if anybody else has a question, just unmute yourself or press the space bar down and ask Bill anything.
Sure.
Bill, I had a question on, you showed a hopper near the end when you're showing different cars, hopper car with an extended side, but there were some slats in a portion of that.
Yes.
What was that car for?
That was a Coke car.
Okay,
The Penske built some of those. The slats were actually gates that would be pulled back, and they put boards up there, and guys would load Coke in there with a wheelbarrow. And then they pull a gate shut to hold the Coke in place. Coke was very lightweight. Coke shipment by gondola was a relatively early activity. And by the maybe 40s or 50s, Coke shipping was very limited. Coke breaks down with any distance in travel. It's a very fragile item. So steel mills found that powdered Coke was of no use to them. So most mills started coking right on site. So you get coal deliveries, they coke and then use it right away in the blast furnace. But at one point in time, coal mines had coke ovens nearby. You see a lot of that stuff, beehive coke ovens and stuff. And because coke was a lot lighter to ship, and they would ship them in hopper cars with extended sides because it was such a light material, they weren't getting anywhere close to the loading limits. But I think that kind of tailed off in the 30s and 40s when they found out the coke was all breaking down in the cars as they would bang along the track, be shifted and that kind of stuff, and it would the coke would just break down. You'd get half a carload of useful coke out of a full carload of coke being shipped. So
okay.
that was a Coke car.
Really good, thank you.
Sure.
Roger had a question. Why don't you go ahead and unmute Roger and ask that?
Hi, Roger. Roger, you're still muted. The unmute button's not at the bottom of the screen, I think.
Yeah, it's on the bottom left, or you can hold down the space bar.
Still getting it, Roger.
Try pressing.
I don't know sign
the space bar
language.
now.
We can try it. Oh, well.
Well, the question that he has on chat says, could you use a rattle can gray primer instead of acrylics to weather trucks and wheels? Also, would it be better to weather trucks and wheels separately, thinking that paint could settle in where the wheel meets the truck and clog?
All good questions. And in fact, about one out of 20 of my weathering jobs will have the paint clog in the journal. Now I got to spin the wheel or do something to get it out of there. Rattle cans are fine. I find that you still have to, you're going to spray with a rattle can, then you got to move the truck because part of it's shaded by the truck frame itself. So you got to get the wheel face painted. But if you use a rattle can, you get paint on the wheel tread, which is not cool. The wheel tread should be kept clean. You don't want any more grime on the railroad than you got already. Human skin cells are what most of the grime is made out of on your trucks. And it's hard enough to combat. The only way I know of is to stay out of your layout room, and they can't do that. But you don't want to get the paint on the tread of the wheels. Now you can paint the side frames certainly with a rattle can. I see no problem with that. But you want to get it a darker gray than like you don't want a primer gray. You want almost a black gray, and you want some variation in the color as well. Oftentimes when I painted a truck, as it's drying, I will pick it back up again, and I'll dip my paintbrush in some earth colors or some grays powder, and I'll wipe it on the truck frame. The powder oftentimes will dissolve into the paint, but will create some variation in the coloration. So it's not a straight flat color. It has some odd variations. It looks like there's been some grime collected off of its many journeys across the country.
Bill, can you hear me now?
I can. Hi, Roger.
How you doing? Say, very good presentation, Bill. I was wondering on using the rattle cans is, you're absolutely right. You can't, you're going to paint everything, the axle and the treads and everything, but it's painstaking. But I've gone back with like a Q-tip or maybe even a toothpick and cleaned the treads with some,
like alcohol or
oh gosh, I'm trying to think of another solvent to get it off, but that does take time.
I've gotten to the point where it's easy enough for me just to grab the truck in my fingers and
Mhm,
spin the wheel and just hold the brush against it.
mhm.
It's a no thinking type activity, you know. It's
Yeah.
I can be watching a documentary on World War II, Japanese occupation of Korea, you know, and I'm doing it or something like that, you know.
Mhm.
It's a brainless type thing that I kind of do, and it's all right. And I'll do
Very
a
good.
batch of trucks. I'll just dip my paintbrush in there and just keep rolling, you know.
Hmm.
And that's why I got a drawer full of trucks that I can use on anything I can use. Want to build.
Good technique. Thank you.
Yeah, Bill, something that I picked up over time was actually two different sets of plastic jigs you could put the wheels in. They
Yes.
protected the tread, and you just spray the face. And
That-
I found that worked really well.
That does, yes.
And then I'd stick the trucks on a skewer and just hit them with flat black just to get started with the, I'd give it tooth so that the weathering, the paint wouldn't come off.
Excellent approach, Andy. And those wheel holders work very well. I got one of them and I used it, but you know, I just, it just doesn't, getting it out and painting a massive number of wheels, it's just not something I do very often. You know, I just kind of will sit there and play with trucks here and there, but not that many at a time. So
Right.
it hardly gets used, but I have used it. And it works pretty good. In fact, it works really well.
Yeah.
I wish they made one for 62-inch drivers on steam locomotives.
Yeah.
I pay an awful lot of those. It's rare if ever you see a steam locomotive with shiny rims. You know, and that's something that every brass and every model locomotive seems to have is a nickel silver rim. I like to get rid of those things too.
Yeah.
And you know, shiny axle ends.
Does anybody else have any questions?